Hello friends, Patrick here again, video number 6, reviewing The Greatest Story Ever Told by Lawrence Krauss. In this video, we're going to be talking about chapter 13. He quotes from Hebrews chapter 11 at the beginning of the chapter, which is quite interesting because the quote that he uses, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. I'm surprised that he doesn't go a little further down in Hebrews 11 and mention the scripture that says the things that are seen are made of the things that are not. He obviously must be familiar with that scripture. Why he would not include it in this book is beyond me. But anyway, he talks about in chapter 13, he talks a lot about the personal stories of different physicists. And essentially, this is a history of the personal stories of different physicists throughout the 19th, 20th, 21st century. The personal stories like by different individuals, and each individual he mentions seems to get the Nobel Prize. He'll bring up a physicist and say, and they won the Nobel Prize for that, and then they won the Nobel Prize for that. Kind of like Oprah. Everybody gets a car. You get a Nobel Prize, you get a Nobel Prize. Everybody he mentioned gets a Nobel Prize in here. They give them out like candy. And he mentions specific physicists, Yang, Mills, Julian Schwinger, Feynman, all types of different types. So he mentions here again, and he mentions this a number of times in the book. He keeps coming back to it. He says, as I have often said, lack of understanding is neither evidence for God nor evidence that one is necessarily wrong. It's just evidence of lack of understanding. And he should be saying that more understanding always points to God. As the reason why he needs to say that, or feel the need to say that, is because whenever he runs into a roadblock, or physicists run into a roadblock, or they discover something unexpected, this is not the greatest story ever told. It's a story of red herrings and mistakes and backtracking and coming up with new theories and so on and so forth. But whenever they find a new truth, it's always pointing to how marvelous God is and how amazing creation is, but they're never willing to allow themselves to mention that. He kind of petulantly goes back and repeats that phrase whenever he runs into a situation where there is lack of understanding. He just says, it doesn't mean that God is the answer, So he keeps referring to that phrase. He mentions Sheldon Glashow, a famous physicist, and the different characteristics that these different physicists have. He makes it quite personal. The stories are quite personal stories. And he finishes the chapter by saying that all the known forces in nature, except gravity, would be unveiled and understood, seemed like a fantasy at the time. So he's indicating that they're going to discover all these known forces in nature as we go forward through the book, which they don't essentially do. But anyway, chapter 14, he introduces the chapter with a quote from Job. And the quote is, from whose womb has come the ice and the frost of heaven, who has given it birth? And I don't know if he takes that scripture to heart or not, but he does mention his analogy of our existence as if it's similar to being a crystal on a plane of glass that has formed into ice. And he gives a nice picture of crystals forming on glass. And that is his view of our reality. We're just existing on one tiny little crystal. And he mentions that a few times in the book. He introduces the term spontaneous symmetry breaking, and he explains how this relates to the Higgs field. And he introduces superconductivity in this chapter, in chapter 14, which is a very interesting concept. And that's fun to read, talking about how a current will just keep going and going in a material that is superconductive. They cool it down to absolute zero or near absolute zero. And when they do that, they realize that a current generated in such a material will just keep going and going forever, kind of like a perpetual motion kind of thing. Superconductivity, fascinating. And again, he mentions more physicists, Carl Wayman, Eric Cornell, and then they get a Nobel Prize, of course. Everybody gets a Nobel Prize in Neil Strauss's book, Lawrence Krauss's book. I'm sorry, not Neil, Lawrence Krauss. And he describes the atomic nuclei, protons and neutrons within this particle zoo. There's all these different particles that they're introducing, bosons and protons and neutrons and all these different subparticles. And he discusses them quite eloquently, since he is an expert when it comes to physics. Chapter 15 is called Living Inside a Superconductor. He uses a quote from Psalms: "Everyone lies to their neighbor. They flatter with their lips, but harbor deception in their hearts." What does chapter 15 talk about? He says that there's a potentially infinite number of elementary particles with ever higher masses seems to characterize the microscopic world. So just like the universe on a grand scale in the cosmos, it seems to go on infinitely. Similarly, in the microscopic world, there could just be elementary particles going off into infinity, smaller and smaller, or larger and larger masses, or smaller and smaller masses, however you want to describe it, however he wants to describe it. And he just throws that out in passing. So it's funny because there's a certain level of futility that he introduces to the study of physics. And even though, of course, he says how brave and courageous they are to keep studying and making all these discoveries and so on and so forth. So he introduces Gell-Mann. He wins a Nobel Prize. He introduces the physicist Sakurai, but he doesn't mention that he got a Nobel Prize. I think that's the first physicist he mentioned who doesn't get a Nobel Prize. And their experiments with superconductivity, the fascinating effects, and dealing with electromagnetism. He often refers back to Plato's analogy of the people trapped in a cave and they only see those shadows. He often refers back to that. He includes the interesting diagrams for the different directions of electromagnetic waves, the E and B fields, and so on and so forth. And then he finishes the chapter by saying that the notion that we may live in some kind of cosmic superconductor. He throws it out as a possibility. He says humans are capable of generating wild stories to explain what is otherwise not understood. Well, physicists do too. They can come up with all kinds of wild stories if they want to. He says they invent fantastical and hidden causes such as God and demons to explain things. And while physicists come up with their own gods and demons, they just call them by different names. So his argument is a little funny. So that's the end of chapter 15. And we'll move on quickly to chapter 16, the bearable heaviness of being, symmetry broken, physics fixed. And he quotes from John: "Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost." I guess it's kind of indirectly related to fragments of particles, I suppose. He introduces again Peter Higgs in 1960 and the work that he did developing the theories for the Higgs particle and the Higgs field, both, and mentioning that the universe could behave like a superconductor. It's an interesting theory that they're talking about, and it's a short, brief chapter, so mostly talking about Higgs and the research of other associated physicists on these bosons, particles. Then we move on to part 3, which is called Revelation. I'm just going to keep going here. I could break this up into a few videos, but I'll try and power through here. Chapter 3 is called Chapter 17, The Wrong Place at the Right Time. He quotes from Corinthians: "Be not deceived, evil communications corrupt good manners." That's from 1 Corinthians he quotes. He quotes from Stephen Weinberg and his work that he did, and his history of study in academia. That's chapter 17. He introduces the concept of the W and Z particles, and he mentions that they could arise as an accident of nature. He talks about it being perhaps an accident of nature. So chapter 17. We'll move on from there. Chapter 18, the fog lifts. Their voice goes out throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. That's a quote he includes from Psalm 19. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Again, a testimony. This guy is facing constant testimony of the reality of God. And the more that it testifies to his own conscience, the more he fights back against it in whatever ways that he can find. The fog lifts, he talks about how the developments in physics start to give them a clearer understanding of the standard model. A lot of it parallels what I covered in Lisa Randall's book, but he goes into much more detail than Lisa Randall does, I would have to say, as far as the actual physics. Lisa Randall goes more into detail on the Hadron Collider, where he goes more into detail on the different theories, and also, of course, the different individuals that came up with those theories. He goes into deep detail. He introduces the Dutch physicist Gerhardus te Hooft, and he introduces his work in this chapter, talking again about the Z particles, talking about the characteristics of the Large Hadron Collider and the large bubble chamber that they built to detect particles. Fascinating stuff on the Hadron Collider that was not covered in Lisa Randall's book. So yeah, much more interesting stuff here about the Hadron Collider and the SLAC particle accelerator and the experiments that they did in discovering protons. Let's move on quickly to chapter 19, and then I think I'll save the rest for the end of for the last video. Chapter 19 is called Free at Last. He quotes from Exodus, "Let my people go." And so developing more theories and finally, discovering quarks and more particles, and introducing Sheldon Glashow again, the up and down quarks, all these different things, the different charges, the positive and negative charges, more results coming in from the large particle accelerators and how that fits into their understanding of the standard model of subatomic physics. And here also he introduces on page 241 the concept of quantum chromodynamics. He had talked earlier about quantum electrodynamics. In this chapter, he introduces the concept of quantum chromodynamics, which introduces another 3 levels of complexity, if you want to call it that. I'm not going to try and summarize it because it's very complex discussion that a lot of it goes straight over my head as a layperson, which I understand. But it introduces another 3 levels of complexity, and they use the colors red, green, or blue. There's some good YouTube videos also that discuss quantum chromodynamics if you want to check those out. He goes on to talk about quarks and antiquarks and the different charges that they have. All this becomes quite deeply technical. So if you're interested in physics, it'd be a great book for you, of course. He talks more about symmetry breaking, and he still is willing to mention that a lot of things that they observe are for reasons they don't understand. And he says, we have every reason to expect that other elementary particles exist that have never been observed. So they admit that there could be all kinds of elementary particles below quarks and below different types of quarks and below neutrinos. There could be all kinds of other different types of particles. And that they realize that there could be an invisible field permeating all space that they haven't discovered yet. And so that's the end of chapter 19. Maybe we'll just move on from there and leave that for this video because I'm getting deep into time here. And I want to keep these videos as short as I can. I'll keep this under 15 minutes. So again, thank you so much for watching. We've reached up until chapter 20. In the next video, it'll be our final video. I'll finish off the book. And it's quite remarkable of how the book actually ends. So thank you so much for watching. God bless you. We'll talk to you in the next video.